course, we're going to have Dr. Ray Garendi on a little later.
Yeah, chat with Pat coming up as well. We also have Who Said That coming up in a minute. But right now, talk about being a gift to one another. It's time for Becoming Gift with Andrew Reinhart. Good morning, Andrew.
Hey, Andrew.
Good morning, Pat, Dave, and Ron. How are you?
Doing fabulous.
Good.
How are you this morning?
I'm doing great.
Good.
I'm doing great.
Good.
So today I wanted to talk about longevity, extending lifespan. You know, it's in our first reading today. It says Abraham was 100 years old when his son Isaac was born to him.
Right.
And when I read that in Genesis 21, I thought, oh my gosh, I'm almost 40 and I feel like I'm having a hard time keeping up with my kids.
With them, yeah.
But this last week it hit the news that earlier in June, a group of Chinese scientists published in the journal Cell that they were able to reverse aging in primates. What would be the equivalent of a 15-year life extension in humans using modified stem cells to overexpress the FOXO3 gene in those primates. You know, so I think it kind of made me ponder this idea of longevity science and extending human lifespan. You know, how does our church actually think about this? You know, I think longevity is a great proxy for overall health. And there's a lot of other different criteria or thoughts we might have about, you know, what it means to be healthy. But if something's going to help us to live longer overall, I think that's a good sign that it's just good for health in general. You know, other proxies for overall health, you might think of something like weight is a common one, right? But there might be a lot of reasons you're losing weight. You could be losing weight because you're sick, or maybe you struggle with a mental illness or something like that too. So there's a lot of reasons why you might lose weight. But if something is going to help you live longer, it's probably a good sign that it's also making you healthier. I think we have to ponder, though, we do have a right to life,
Right.
right? But do we have a duty to actually extend our life? Right? Every right has a corresponding responsibility. So I think our right to life comes with it the responsibility to live well, but do we have to live forever? When we think about this, though, I think some of the criteria we already have in our Catholic ethics help. Like Pope Pius XII, in an audience to the International Congress of Anesthesiologists in 1957, introduced the principle of ordinary versus extraordinary means. He said, but normally one is held to use only ordinary means, according to circumstance of persons, places, times, and cultures, that is to say, means that do not involve any grave liberty, anything grave or extreme. So in this idea, he's proposing this idea of ordinary means versus extraordinary means. And he says, well, you don't have a responsibility or a duty to use anything extraordinary to extend your life. And he's talking about here, you know, specifically medical procedures. You know, like maybe you're 90 years old and you're choosing whether or not to have a cancer treatment done to you or something like that.
Right.
But we're entering into a space, maybe a kind of space age, so to speak, where people are going to have to choose whether or not to even extend their life further. You know, we're thinking of these novel gene therapies. There's even doctors now that have different protocols for exercise and diet and being kind of more proactive with medications. And, you know, I think probably working to extend their patients' lifespans 10 or 20 years beyond what's typically expected. You know, so as Catholics, when we think about this, some other principles that I think are healthy are we also have not only a right to life, but a duty to die well. When Pope St. John Paul II talked about this in his letter on the right to life, the Gospel of Life, he talks about having the duty to die well, because this life is to lead us to the next life.
Right.
Like, this life is a preparation for heaven. So we know that indefinite life expansion, you know, is really kind of avoiding heaven, or the converse, avoiding hell. Right? But should we extend our life to 100, to 110, 120? I think this is a question that our church will have to continue to wrestle with and ponder.
Yeah.
But I think it will really come down to motivations in the human heart. You know, what is your motivation? Are you a priest that, you know, 10 more years of life is going to be 10 more years of distributing the sacraments and giving spiritual direction and confession? Maybe longevity is a potential response to our priest shortage in the church, right? Or are you just afraid of dying and you don't want to face that judgment? Or maybe you just want to accumulate an excessive amount of wealth or extend your power. Maybe you can, become president for a fourth or fifth time if you can live into your hundreds. So I think a lot of this is going to come down to the motivation of the human heart.
Yeah.
But if it's not us making these decisions, it will be our children making these decisions.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I remember, Andrew, a few years back when I was teaching in bioethics, the subject of genetics, and there was some big breakthrough a number of years ago, and they were interviewing the scientist, and he said, "Oh yeah, this is really good," but he said, "We've got a long way to go in this science because we have not figured out yet how to make people live forever." And I thought, yeah, we did.
Yeah, right.
I mean, it's like, but I think part of this is a faith crisis issue too, right? I mean, if you don't believe that there's anything after this, then yeah, I mean, I want to keep going as long as I can. But, last week we were talking a little bit on the show about a friend who's, had a death in their family, and he kept saying, "It's okay, I can't wait to get to heaven," right? I mean, there is a sense of peace with that versus, boy, I just got to keep going because there's nothing after this.
Yeah, but also in the scriptures, you have to say that one promise after the next is associated with a long life. Like, if you do this, you do that, you'll have a long life on the land that the Lord your God has given you. We see it in Proverbs, we see it in Psalms. We see it all over the scriptures. And I assume at least some of the times that's speaking of physical life.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I don't think there's many people who think the idea of extending life to 80 years old, 90 years old, 100 years old, 110 years old, within the bounds of reason would be immoral. But the question would be, what about 130? What about 140? What about 200? So on and so forth. There's transhumanists whose ultimate plan is to create a way for us to upload our consciousness into computers.
Ooh.
Right.
We can live on indefinitely in a virtual reality. So we're now, I think all of these problems are probably a lot more complex than we suppose at this point.
Right.
And so the technology will take a lot longer, if it will ever be possible.
Yeah, I, for one
One
would
idea
say
I want to throw in here.
my consciousness, when it's done, should go away. Honestly, it probably should not hang around. I'm just saying.
Yeah, Andrew?
One concept I think is really important is that the importance of passing things on to the next generation. A good book that was read a couple years ago is From Strength to Strength by Arthur Brooks. And he talks about the different phases of life. And one of the things he talks about is the way that our human intelligence shifts as we get older and really primes us to become more of an advisor, a wise figure, a teacher, someone who is in that more of a sage role. So I think one of the signs of an unhealthy demographics in society is that the key leaders get older and older and older, and positions of leadership are passed on at later and later ages. Because I think I'm a lot better off, not if I'm the wise one that's in charge, but if I'm wise and there are people ahead of me that can advise me. Right? There are people that sort of stand over top of the person in power with a kind of soft power, with a kind of influence, with a kind of intelligence, with an experience, and they can guide the person in charge. So I think a piece of this is even starting to let go within our own lifespan so that we can then raise up the next generation of leaders.
Yep.
I love it. And look,
Very
we all
true.
have enough experience walking with elderly, accompanying them as they make their way from this life to the next. And there is a peace that is wrapped around that thing, honestly, a joy and an excitement that's wrapped around that. So, yeah, when it comes, it's a beautiful thing for those who know the Lord, that's for sure.
A lot to think about there. Thank you so much, Andrew Reinhart.
Thanks, Andrew.
Thank you so much.
Have a great day. Can't wait to chat again. Chat with Pat is coming up a little later, and, of course, Dr. Ray Garendi, and a little game coming up next.